very warm welcome to King's College for those of you who are coming from outside King's, and today's seminar on South Asia and the First World War, a forum of debate and reflection. I'm Shantanu Das and I teach at King's College London, and this is a very exciting event because I think for the last and for people like Rosina and Dominic, maybe for the last 20 years, we have been working on the broad subject of South Asia and the First World War. So we thought of bringing together people who had been involved in this area so that we can have a conversation, we can showcase what's happening and also facilitate a critical reflection. The event is co-organized by myself, Iqbal Hussain from the National Archives, Ajay Chhabra from the performance company Nutkhut, and Santosh Chandra and Eleanor Harding from the Asian Center. The seminar is organized under the auspices of an ongoing collaborative research project, Cultural Exchanges in a Time of Global Crisis, and is funded by the Humanities in European Research Area and the Center for Hidden Histories based in Nottingham University. And I'm very grateful to Natasha there, who had really had been absolutely central to bringing us all together. 29th April 1916 is possibly the most crucial date in the Indian calendar of the First World War, the day of the fall of Kut after a long siege by the Turkish forces during which many starved. And on that day, around 10,440 South Asians, including 204 officers, 7,000 soldiers, and 3,240 followers were taken as POWs of the Turks and subjected to almost systematic abuse, malnourishment, and backbreaking labor for the next few years. We wanted to mark that date as well as also use it to take stock of what we have been doing for the last few years. And also to reflect on not just what we are doing, but how we are doing it, and put our heads together in thinking about how to go forward. One thing I think we all have to agree about the centennial commemoration is the quite extraordinary visibility of the colonial troops, particularly the South Asian contribution to the First World War. And we can say, I think with some certainty, it has really put the South Asians finally on the map of the First World War more generally. And I think every one of us in the room are united by one common aim: to increase that visibility, to reach out to as many people as we can through different routes, to different practices, and possibly, and this is a hope I know which is widely shared, to bring the South Asian experience to the school curriculum so that the next generation will know. And signs have been encouraging because the energy that we had been seeing around it for the last couple of years has been nothing short of extraordinary. And I haven't seen anything of that, for example, in France or for Germany, or even, rather regrettably, in India or Pakistan. But having reached the midpoint of this extraordinary commemorative, almost tsunami, as I've begun to think, we'd also take stock of what we commemorate, which particular stories we choose to highlight, how we choose to highlight those stories, whom do we tell, and to what purpose. And here we have assembled people from different sectors: the military, academia, from various community projects, museums. And though our intent is similar, as we said, our approach and focus may be slightly different. For commemoration is no private remembrance. Neither is history an objective science or removed from who we are or what we do. We are invariably interested not just by what the past wants to tell us, but also what we think is relevant to the present. And I think one of the most important points that hopefully will emerge from the discussion, from today's discussion, is the often difficult negotiation that we had been doing over the last 2 years between what perhaps we can call kind of term as historical authenticity, the painful and often messy history of the South Asian participation in the war with its racial hierarchies and, for example, martial race theories, and the current equally important need for racial integration and harmony, and particularly in today's climate, for example, when we are seeing this kind of quite extraordinary campaign against Sadiq Khan. Do projects get co-opted by contemporary concerns such as multiculturalism, and is that a problem? Or is it that in today's troubled times, it is more important than ever that it should be our primary focus, and we should use the war to heal, we should use a past war to heal the wounds of the present, and thus help us to forge a diverse future? Second, how do we reach the highest number of people? What is the role of community projects? Because they are the vital nodes. They put kind of projects right at the center of public consciousness. And the creative industry, who introduce kind of generations of people to a creative and innovative engagement with the past, and are almost entrusted with the work of bringing history alive. Third, is the commemoration of South Asia and the First World War primarily founded on the fact that centenary funding is available? Are some of the aims and agendas partly guided by that? And if so, can we turn it into our advantage and reflect on our practices? We have here, as I said, people from different sectors, community engagement groups, the Heritage Lottery Fund, museums, academia, the creative sector, independent scholars. And part of the aim is to share, respect each other's views, discuss, and also engage perhaps in some honest debate, and ultimately share our similar and yet slightly divergent perhaps points of view. We have kind of some speakers who will be speaking about their projects for a very kind of maybe 2 or 3 minutes. And if you could, and I will kind of introduce you, I will just kind of introduce you by name, but when you start, if you just maybe mention your particular project or where you come from, and just kind of to remind you of the sequence, we'll start with Rosina Visram, then Manish Tawal, then Jasdeep Singh, Awais Muhammad, Dominic Rai, Iqbal Hussain, Elena Harding, now I've lost Elena Harding, and finally Ajay Chhabra. So if you just kind of repeat your name and maybe just kind of also introduce your project and then speak for maybe 2 or 3 minutes, and then we can launch into the discussion. Thanks. So Rosina.
Right, I'm Rosina Visram, and have normally been known as the pioneer of the history of Asians in Britain from 1600 to 1950. And I want to start with a general introduction. How did I come to do things about the First World War, which isn't quite the right way of starting? Because what had happened was that in 1983, I was given a teacher fellowship by Ilya. And Ilya at that point was trying to, and I won't go into that because a lot is available, trying to counter racism in schools and the curriculum. And we were told, if you won the fellowship, to produce school materials for use in the classroom, to try as a tool for fighting racism and of course integration and a move away from Eurocentric curriculum that schools were really used to doing. So here I am. It really began as a book with many different bits of Asians in Britain, and of course First World War is a large section of it. Now I'll now go on to what is known as the focus of my subject.
Up, because it's a long table.
Okay, what drew me to research and write about Asians in Britain was the Anglo-centric bias and interpretation of the history curriculum in London schools, where I began teaching way back in 1972. The curriculum as I saw it offered a narrow, parochial view of British history, an island story, and we are still talking about an island story, and a limited world view. I recall teaching the First World War to a group of fourth-year examination pupils using a tremendous resource called In the Trenches, with British, Irish, Canadian, Australian soldiers, their songs, their letters and experiences of trench warfare on the Western Front. No mention of Indians. It was then that turning the pages of A.J.P. Taylor's The First World War, an Illustrated History, published 72, I came across a photograph that made me sit up. Among a group of European soldiers in the photograph were 3 wounded Indians, one of them on a stretcher. It was the caption that arrested me. It read, "Wounded Indians far from home." Now, I had not known, despite my various degrees and all that, I had not known that Indian soldiers fought on the trenches in Europe, as this would make nonsense of the ideology of the Raj anyway. And so the question was, what happened? How did they come there? How do I find out about them? This became a defining moment for my study of the First World War, but I had to wait until 1983, when I was awarded the Teacher Fellowship by ILIA, which gave me the opportunity, space, time to research and reflect on the process of migration and British history. This is not the place to talk about racial politics of the 1970s and 80s or the campaigns waged by Black and Asians. Suffice it to say that the part of countering racism, ILIA instituted a teacher fellowship scheme to research and produce materials for use in the classroom, and I was one of those lucky people to be given it. What was the particular focus of my study? The photographs were, of course, one major interest, taking me to places like the Imperial War Museum, the Army Museum, and of course, reading contemporary writings like the Times History of the First World War, and other things, obviously. But my particular focus was not on the military battles, because I'm not necessarily one of those kinds of people who like fighting very much. But really, the censored mails in the India Office record. I was particularly interested in what the letters revealed about the lives and feelings of these simple soldiers, their experiences, interactions with each other, because you remember they come from different ethnic groups, with white soldiers and ordinary citizens, and their views and impressions of Britain and Europe, and to what extent the war and their reactions could be seen as an agent of change. The challenges that I faced, now remember there was nothing, because people who wrote about Asians in Britain began with the 1960s. They may talk about a soldier or a sailor or whatever, but nothing was here, no community infrastructure, nothing. And so obviously when I started this, I had to do a very heavy lifting. So of course, knowledge is the first thing. I knew little of Indian history, and I must admit that, as during both my honors history and my MLit, apart from learning European history, my specialism was on Africa, as I'm a third generation East African. It was my grandparents who migrated from Kutch to East Africa, Tanzania. I was born in Zanzibar, my parents were born in Zanzibar, and so this is how I came to it. So I knew a bit about the Africans fighting in Tanzania as porters. I knew a bit about Indian soldiers fighting in Tanzania, because Tanzania at that point was a German colony. So I had to teach myself Indian history, and considering my fellowship year wasn't very long, it meant a lot of work. No easy task. However, my main challenge was where and how to begin, and to finding my way around archives for information. We now forget how much easier the task of a researcher is made by the very many electronic search aids and digitization of sources. And of course, I'm very pleased what the National Archives has been doing, as the India Office has been doing. I had to rely on catalogues and hand lists, and of course, the help of the archivists, who were really very useful and helpful. A mammoth task. Even Martin Moyer's excellent A General Guide to the India Office Records was not available to guide me through the labyrinth of classification of India Office records. Now, those of you who have worked in there would know how difficult it is to find what you are looking for. And of course, Martin Moyer's book was only published 2 years after Ayers, Lascars and Princes. So obviously, it was a pioneering kind of research as far as I was concerned. Another big problem was finding a publisher. As Ilya could no longer publish the school pack, which was part of my fellowship, teacher fellowship scheme, I had approached 5 national school publishers. 2 of them had already published school books on Black history. But the answers I got was they did not consider yet another book on Black history to be a worthwhile commercial proposition, because schools, according to them, around the country would not find it relevant. And I think we are still fighting that battle. To me, this was very surprising, as I considered this history to be part of British history for all children, and not just immigrant children, because at the end of the day, you live in London and there are all these children in London schools, but what about the White Highlands and things like that? So thanks to Pluto Press, who suggested I turn it into a book for the general readers as a companion to Peter Fryer's Stay in Power, which led to Ayers, Lascars and Princes in 1986 to be published. You are all familiar with that, and I've heard lovely things from most people about the influence that book has had on you. And later, a couple of school books, and then a lot of independent research, and in 2002 came The Asians in Britain, 400 Years of History, both of which have substantial chapters on the First World War.
Thank you so much, Rosanna. In fact, in many ways, you are the cause why we are here. Thank you, Manish.
My name's Surgeon Lieutenant Commander Manish Tile. I'm a Royal Navy officer, so I guess I'm the amateur here, so you'll have to excuse me. The reason that I'm involved in this area is I'm chair of the Armed Forces Hindu Network. Next to me is Major Sardar Singh Gogna, who is chair of the British Armed Forces Sikh Association, and we're also working with the Armed Forces Muslim Association. So there's the three of the faith networks within defence, and the three networks are essentially running this project We Were There Too, which partly follows on from a project about 10 to 15 years ago called We Were There, which was an exhibition run by the MOD looking at the contributions of Commonwealth people to UK defence through the years, including the First World War. So in true armed forces style, I'll start off with the first principle of war, which is selection and maintenance of the aim. Our aim is to explore, commemorate and share Indian experiences of the First World War. What does that mean? Well, it means that we want to look at the experiences of those involved in the war, whether that's the soldiers, sailors and airmen themselves, or their families and loved ones who were left behind, or the various other people who were impacted by their participation. And that extends out to us today as well. So what is the impact, what was the impact then, and what is the impact of the Indian participation on us today as British Asians or as Britain generally? That's a really, really broad remit. And so Shantanu asked when he sent out the invitation to talk about one problem or challenge in the project, and I think that's really it. So there's obviously lots of great work going on in this area, and the fact that there's so many people here all running various different projects on it, most of which I've seen a fair bit of and been quite impressed with, is testament to that. So the first thing is, well, we're not about reinventing the wheel. If something's already being done, there's no point us doing it as well. So what we'd much rather do is, if someone's doing something, then we'd much rather help them to do it. So if there's a project happening that you want to spread wider, then we can help, because obviously the armed forces have a large network throughout the country and beyond that we can lean on. And that's just one example. So where we want to really see ourselves is plugging gaps, I suppose you could say. So then the next thing is, well, how do you identify what are the gaps in what's already been done? And hopefully today will go some way to identifying that. And one of the problems that we've had so far is that, and I was discussing this before, is that every time you sort of think, okay, we'll start working on this area, you see that someone else has started doing that, and so we'd rather pull back, help them with that bit of it, rather than two different projects trying to do the same thing at the same time. So that's the first half of this problem, and the second half of it is, as I alluded to, essentially the management of mission creep. Because it is such a huge area, and because we've given ourselves a fairly broad remit, how do you find the balance between going too niche, which means that you lose broad interest, and on the other hand, making it too big so that it becomes A, unmanageable, and B, kind of loses a bit of meaning, and it's trying to find that balance. So I guess for me, today is really useful, and so I'm looking forward to hearing and learning from you all. Thanks very much.
So my name is Jasdeep Singh, and I'm from the National Army Museum. I'm a curator at the NAM, dealing with the NAM's Indian Army collection. Some of you know about the National Army Museum, many don't, and so just a bit of an overview. We're currently closed. That's not a great start. It's not a great start, so don't visit us right now, because the museum looks like a trench, but with the support of the Heritage Lottery Fund, we're redeveloping into a new museum, and when we open early next year, we will be able to tell new and exciting stories. But the NAM is a really interesting place. I don't just say that because I work there, but we have a very, very rich collection relating to India. And our collection spans over 250 years. It covers almost all forms of conflict between Britain and India, actually both as enemies and as allies. And we hold really some very fascinating objects. I think we hold a portion of Jhansi Rani's sari that she wore during the mutiny to, the weapons belonging to Bahadur Shah Zafar as Delhi fell, right the way up to photographs and sketches and uniforms, part of our 80,000 strong collection of uniforms relating to the First World War and the Second World War. In terms of our Indian Army collection, it spanned from the early days of the East India Company to the partition of India. So we feel we can really tell a complete story about when we're looking at the First World War, in terms of how did these men get here? What's the backstory about each of the men? And we can dip into the south of India to the north of India and really explore that. At the NAM, I currently lead 4 projects, and it is a bit of a juggling game at the moment. 3 of them are funded by the HLF, and they are essentially aimed at looking at engaging with communities, looking at our collection again, and seeing if we maybe missed a trick or some of the curators over the past few decades have. When I first started, I looked at our collection and I realized, well, hold on, that's not Agra at all, that's not Delhi, and that's not, Subedar this thing, or that's not this, and it was very obvious. And then I came into minute details of inaccuracies in our cataloguing, and it was primarily because we didn't have anybody from that background or from that specialist subject sort of area. And so I set about correcting what I could and then working with communities to be able to do that. And now our records speak to communities, and they're co-curated. It's not just the curator with his elbow pads. It's not just his view or her view. It's a co-curated view. So just to sum up, the projects that we're running at the moment are geared towards engaging new audiences and new communities. And one of the projects that I'm working on at the moment is called Brothers in Arms, and the project has just digitized 21,000 Indian Army images from our collection. And these are newly digitized, never been seen by the public before. And of those exist the earliest photographs ever taken in India from 1847. So I'm really excited about those images. They're due to go online very soon. We're working with volunteers in terms of getting some captions put on those, and we're really excited about using those and getting community projects, authors, researchers to use them. I have worked with probably half this room, whether it's working with the UK Punjab Heritage's exhibition, or Dr. Blighty, which is coming up, or Eleanor and Awais, and looking at their projects and how we can support their exhibitions. I mean, we just had a meeting today with Sartaj and Manish going forward, looking at how our collection can support projects. I think we're in a position where we've got so many images and they've never been seen by the public. We can start to tell new stories, and as a result, some new discoveries and stories have been made. So I'm really keen on working with as many people as possible to disseminate this collection. So if you want to use some of our collection, get in touch. Here you go.
Thanks, Jessica. Would you like to add one moment, please? Would you like to add one sentence? You're being very humble about your amazing reenactment. That is one of the 4 projects. When we looked at bringing to life the First World War and the experiences they went through, rather than just looking at black and white images. For me, I like to look at things creatively. So we recruited a group of volunteers from the British Indian community to recreate a reenactment of the 15th Ludhiana Sikh Regiment. The guys have been trained in the drill from the First World War. They've got uniform from that period. They've cooked using those rations. They've stayed out in those in the tents, and they have learnt about the history. And as a result, they speak to the public about how that feels, just stepping into the boots of these soldiers, even for a day. And we are going to work with Ajay going forward, and many other projects we have worked with. But to me, it's bringing those photos alive. And I have some photos today, if you want to have a look. There's some little cards at the front, and I have an album, a photograph album, taken of our guys with a camera that's 100 years old. So we've really tried to play with history and go forward and back. So it's an old, new album, so to speak. So please get in touch, have a look. I'll put it out here for you guys to have a look. Thank you.
Good evening, my name is Jeb Hardwick, and I'm project manager of Unknown and Unsolved, a think tank called British Future. Unknown and Unsolved, the story of Britain's World War I Indian Muslims, is an HLF funded project carried out in partnership between think tank British Future and New Horizons and British Islam. Promoting the 400,000 Indian Muslims who served Britain in World War I, the project's working in Birmingham, Leicester, Woking, and closely with the armed forces. Now, none of us involved in this project are academics or historians. Our primary concern is how this heritage may be used for contemporary benefit, namely promoting integration between British Muslim and mainstream communities. To this end, we've already been quite successful, winning interest from a broad scope of the media, including conservative-facing outlets, and generally receiving a warm and welcome response from all audiences. Our youth project in Birmingham perhaps illustrates our reception best.
Working with a mainly British Muslim youth group in Lozells, made up of British Pakistani and British Bangladeshi youth, and also a mainly British non-Muslim youth group in Kingstanding, made up of predominantly British African Caribbeans and white Britons. We delivered seminars highlighting the Indian Muslim contribution to World War I before the young people interviewed the descendants of those Indian Muslim soldiers currently living in their own city. Feedback from both sets of young people demonstrated the equal significance this shared heritage has amongst all communities. The British Muslim youth expressed how they felt more British, knowing that men from their ancestral homes fought for this country, contributing to this version of British identity that we all enjoy today. One of them, I remember quite starkly, said proudly how knowing about this allowed him to walk taller and prouder in the street. Similarly, the non-Muslim youth expressed a broadening in their understandings and definitions of what it means to be British, as well as addressing myths regarding any inherent incompatibility between being being Muslim and being British. This has been indicative of how we found this heritage to be received in our project. Whilst this alone would have indicated a significant level of success for us, I'm glad that in our efforts to promote integration in Britain, this hasn't been our only approach. Recently, we've also been working in Leicester, alongside the National Army Museum and Jasdeep Singh in particular, Britain's first minority-majority city, with a significant Hindu, Muslim and Sikh communities there. We thought it important to also highlight the shared heritage of Hindus, Muslims and Sikhs fighting side by side in Leicester, using the shared heritage in bringing these three Leicester-based faith communities together. Here too we found that all communities received the heritage with enthusiasm, providing a needed opportunity for these faith communities to share a valued experience on equal terms. Speaking candidly, I'm particularly glad we worked in Leicester too. Promoting the Muslim contribution without mention of their Hindu and Sikh comrades and countrymen would have felt like a tragic omission. What emerged from Leicester was a common belief amongst participants that while promoting the shared heritage of Commonwealth soldiers serving Britain in World War I fosters integration between individual communities and majority society, and that remains crucially important. The nature of our rich and diverse society should also mean that efforts are similarly made to facilitate integration amongst minority groups too. After all, if integration is our objective, working for it in isolation seems an anomaly. I look forward to more and more opportunities enabling us to work across our communities as well as in relation to the mainstream. Thank you very much.
Dominic.
Thank you, everyone, for your contribution so far. I'm going to side with Manish to say that I'm also an amateur in this as well. And so it's a very personal journey, but now it's been for a number of years with my colleague Caroline, who's sitting on the other end, who was the administrator for Manuela Theatre Company. So we had a particular passion for this story, but I'll tell you how it started. At the age of 16, I actually thought I knew everything about World War I. And all 16-year-olds do. And but in my early 20s, when I came to London to work for a theatre company called Tara Arts, I was learning to read and write Urdu as an adult. And I was sent to the India Records Library. And one of our administrators there was head of Urdu. So she showed me some stuff, and then she said, here's some letters from World War I. And I was genuinely astonished because I didn't actually know there were any Empire troops at all, because we'd never been taught them. And I had studied English literature and the war poets and history. We had World War I as a topic. And so that started a journey, those letters. And it culminated in me writing to Mulk Raj Anand, the author of this book, which was published in 1940, but written in the late 30s. and it's about the Indian experience, or undivided Indian experience, of World War One, and it was at this point now that it became real for me, and the fiction enabled really for me to understand the facts. So the journey has continued, and I just want to talk a little about where we want to end with this. So this year, we have a legacy kind of thinking about this, and I say that without any knowledge or receipt of any public funds at any point. So, but our legacy part is that we want a new generation of up to 1 million to know about this story. And so we're publishing an e-book. We have contributed to a number of award-winning programs on the radio and TV, including another Mahabharata. And we continue to find new things about new ways of engaging and with private collectors. Here's the Kishan Devi postcard, which was a letter written by a young girl to her soldier father in 1916. So we use that to engage with. And so that's the story. We will bring back the production as well. We did one in '98. And the production will be brought back. But I have to say that I do have an agenda as well. And the agenda isn't too different from what Aveves has actually mentioned. I do use it as a prism to look at pre-partition and to look at the whole idea of undivided India, undivided Punjab, and the Punjabi identity. So that's been a real thing for me, and I've had the opportunity, particularly with the National Archives, to do a very moving project which was called A Heart Divided. So which is all relevant to this First World War story because it's based on a regiment, the 57 Wild Rifles, which was a mixed regiment. And that, I think, has got many, many lessons for us for today, because the Western Front, we know from the French Empire, as well as the British Empire, was as culturally diverse as Britain is today. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really sorry, there's kind of another speaker who can, and I'd forgotten to mention, and that's Harbakhsh Grewal. But before he speaks, since it's my kind of omission, he is part of UK Punjab Heritage, and if there's one single event that stood out for me, that was their exhibition. They staged this extraordinary exhibition. I'd been working in the field for more than 10 years. And I went in quite skeptical almost at what new things can they find. And I was absolutely stunned from kind of a little mirror given to the patients in the Brighton Pavilion to the wonderful letter on which Dominic Rai had worked. So Harbakhsh is going to speak also.
Thank you very much. Excuse me. My name's Harbakhsh Grewal. I'm from, as Anthony said, UK Punjab Heritage Association, and I've got a slight problem with my throat, so excuse me for a minute. UK PHA is a charity that's been going since approximately 2001, so it's about 15 years old, and it was founded by two amateur historians who are my colleagues, Amandeep Madra and Paramjit Singh. And these two gentlemen have started an avalanche in research into original Sikh traditions. So we look at predominantly Sikh history going back to the times of the Gurus. We're talking about a 500-year span of history. And our aim is to produce academically rigorous work, researching primary sources as much as possible, and not just regurgitating what's already there. And what's arisen out of that is a publishing house. We have a social enterprise publishing house called Kashi House, and we've produced a couple of coffee table books, one on the Golden Temple and one on Sikh military history, starting from the times of the Gurus, and that's volume 1, and that goes up to and including the Anglo-Sikh Wars. And those have all happened in the preceding period up to the centenary. part of the Golden Temple book was also an exhibition at SOAS, and that brought in something like 23,000 visitors, and we held associated symposiums, and that really was a kind of a blueprint for what we've now gone on to do with the World War I project. So we have a project which began in 2014. It's a 3-year funded project with the Heritage Lottery Fund, and so we're now into the final year of that. And what we're doing with that is in one sense quite fanciful, especially for a community organisation that until this project didn't even have one paid member of staff. And we'd never had anything like this kind of money before. We'd probably not even had a tenth of this money for any projects we've done before. But what we tried to do, and try not to laugh, is we're trying to create a people's history of World War I. So we are Sikhs, we focus on Sikh history, and we appeal predominantly to Sikhs, and British Sikhs in particular. So our great challenge for us is the scope and ambition of what we do, which is frankly slightly laughable, versus the capacity we have in terms of not having paid staff, us all being volunteers, and we have a fine network of professional people we work with inside and outside the organisation, but it's still, it's a big ask. And so we have created a rug for our own backs with our project, because what we decided to do was to think big and then think a bit bigger. In typical Punjabi style, you might say, I don't know. So what we have, our aim ultimately is to actually crowdsource history and to create new history. It's not about us telling the community their story, although at the beginning of the project, that is what we did. At the beginning of the project, we held another exhibition at SOAS at the Brunei Gallery. And the point of doing that was, rather than have an exhibition at the end showing what wonderful things we found and what everyone's done, we wanted to encourage people and tell people about this history, almost like a rallying cry, almost like a recruiting sergeant for our project, and the main underlying theme of the project, which is the Sit as a Historian scheme, which is our way of trying to engage the public to tell their stories. So within 6 months of the money coming in, we held a major exhibition at SOAS. We borrowed all sorts of lovely items from around the world. We used the existing academic information that's out there. And so that in a subset of what we're doing was our greatest challenge as well, which is interpretation. How do you interpret this material? How do you compile it? What themes do you include? What do you leave out? How do you tell the Sikh story? And just quickly on that, I wanted to say that for us, and for me especially, the context is British India, undivided India. So that's and actually the non-white Commonwealth's contribution in both world wars and to British history. That's the bigger story. Within that, we're telling the story of the British Indian Army, and because of our personal interest and our background and our audience, and that diaspora audience that exists here in England, in Britain, we're telling the Sikh story. And why Sikhs? Well, as I said, because of who we are, but also if you look at the stats, at the beginning of the war, Sikhs were around about 1% of the Indian population, and they were 10% of the army, approximately. Sorry, 20%. And by the end of the war, that figure had diluted to 10%. So 1% was producing 10% of the army still. So I think that's a fine enough reason to have done what we've done. And so that's the context we wanted to tell our projects within, and also the fact that this is British history. It's not just about, this isn't just a marginalised story for those brown people over there. It's about telling the rest of the country that this is their story. Our story is your story. We're part of this, just as much as you are. That's what Aves has also been talking about with his project. So we held our big exhibition as a rallying cry. We gathered 24,000 people. We held 5 symposiums with 3 lectures on each occasion, and we finished with a reinterpretation of a 100-year-old Punjabi folk song, which was first written about and talked about by Amarjeet Chandan, who's sitting over there. And we used the man sitting 2 seats to his left to actually do that. And Jasdeep has not told everyone that he's also a classically trained musician, and he and his colleagues reinterpreted that folk song and some other music from 100 years ago. So we completed our symposiums and our our rallying cry to the public with that emotional pull. And that's also telling the story of the home front, which is another aspect of what we're trying to do. So in the period since then, what we've tried to do is carry on engaging the public with events, with social media, with media, mainstream media, Radio 4, Radio 2, The Times, as well as ethnic minority media. And that's a challenge in itself. Just quickly, I'd say, trying to engage, especially what you might call the liberal media, with a story about soldiers and war. The Colonel Blimps and the Daily Telegraph, they're very all over this stuff, but surprisingly, I think it's quite often difficult to get the ones you think would be more interested in it to actually cover it. And so, but going back to our underlying theme, which is the citizen historian scheme, it's trying to engage our community to tell this story, to actually be engaged in this story, because they don't know that this is their story. We don't know that we were a part of World War I. We have no idea. You know, like Dominic, I thought at the age of 14 I knew everything about soldiers and guns and war, but I didn't know any of this. I didn't know I didn't know there was one Indian in either World War. So our challenge now has been, and it continues to be, to engage the public to tell their stories. And in the background, what we're doing is creating a database. And to make that interesting and engaging, we're trying to make that as user-friendly as possible. It's going to be launched next month on our website, Empire, Faith, War. And that will map soldiers' stories to where they came from. Because anyone here from a South Asian background knows that the thing that people connect with is their family roots, their ancestral villages. And also, if you're going to physically map a soldier, where are you going to map him? Where he died? Well, he may have died in his village, he may not have died at war, where he fought, he would have fought all over. So we're going back to the home front to map these people and also hopefully engage those, even if those people don't have a family member who was involved in the war. We're already plotting on that map Commonwealth War Grave Commission records. So I think we've got several thousand records already implanted on there that people can add to, because it's an open access database. So this is our big challenge. One is the technical aspect of that, but the bigger challenge is to get people to populate this database with stories. So some people have already come through. They came to the exhibition with medals and recollections. Some people have been to memorials in Egypt and the Middle East to find their ancestors' name on a plaque somewhere. And we're adding all of these people into our story, into the project, and we're giving them the opportunity to tell their stories. At the end of this project, at the end of the year, we hope to have a book, a free publication, a documentary film, but also a database that people will carry on adding to, and it should live at least for 10 years. That's the plan. So that is pretty much our story. Just one other thing, we have actually thus far, I mean, we have overly, our ambition is incredibly large, but we're doing quite well on that front. We've already achieved 600 sign-ups from the community, from people who want to tell us their stories. So I think we're doing all right.
Thanks.
Okay, my name's Iqbal Hussain. I'm currently working at the National Archives. I've now completed my first year at the National Archives. How I got to the National Archives is an interesting story in itself. But just to say that my own personal background, my mother is Sikh, my father is Muslim. I grew up here, and this story was there somewhere. Rosina's work and others got that work in my mind. I, like Dominic, also went to Tara Arts and spent time there. And it's been a long journey, and so when this opportunity arose, my parents met through their love of arts, music, and I've always had a real passion for the arts. And formerly I was an arts officer for many years in local government. And so when this opportunity arose, and Sarah and I had met, and also I'd met other people, and then this job came, and I thought, I'm going to go for this, and I applied, and the National Archives accepted my application, as it were, my interview, and the first project I was landed with was South Asia and First World War, and I was over the moon, because I thought there's something here that I need to kind of get to grips with. And the project I developed over the first year was care and comfort in the First World War. It was and I admit I've got a history degree, but I'm not an archivist, I'm not a specialist in this area. And so it was me quickly learning, as I said, I think has been echoed by some others, you know, the amateur quickly getting on with it and trying to find out what's the story, what can I tell, and something about these very personal stories that people had, which really became very powerful. Initially, it started with the sort of South Asian story, but as we started to meet community groups, people from different backgrounds started to want to talk about imagining, and this is what the project actually tried to do, imagine what it would be like to communicate and send a letter or a parcel or a gift to somebody that you loved. And it was very fascinating to watch, you know, how people from different backgrounds started to engage with this project. So I was still able to kind of keep a South Asian focus, but actually it kind of organically grew. And this is a project in terms of engaging with people's emotions and their feelings was very, very powerful. And it's been very exciting for all of us, I think, involved in it. And I'm now working for another year at the National Archives, which I'm really excited about. And the research has allowed me to really understand there's a real richness and depth to this story, which I think has been echoed again by many. But I'm also very conscious of the quite complex nature of this story, and also the quite troubling aspects of it. And I'm also quite interested in looking at those, and work from academics like Shantanu and others have been feeding that idea of looking at some of those other aspects that maybe we don't look at. So I'm looking to develop a new project, and I hope that I'll be able to have conversations with people around this table and others around the theme of loyalty and dissent, and looking at some of these themes of loyalty and dissent, and some of the work around the revolutionary networks that were kind of active at the time, and also the different forms of dissent that took place, including and up to mutinies, and also the rising nationalism that was there as well. And that's also something I'm really interested in, and also exploring maybe more about these motivations. What were the motivations that really got people in all these different levels to engage in this war? And so I'm really excited about that. And so that's the new project that we're kind of developing. And the idea there is really to consult with people. And over the summer and in the autumn, I'm looking to do some kind of workshops, not necessarily as the leader, but hopefully as a facilitator, and trying to gauge, because there's a lot of knowledge, not only around this table, but all over the country and elsewhere as well, to kind of really start to bring that out and create something through the sort of the platform that National Archives is providing me, so that I particularly can help to be a bit of a bridge, and those that we engage and work with can hopefully be part of that bridge, so that some of this rich work that academics and others have done can reach out to wider audiences, all with its messiness and its complexity and its difficulties included. And so that's where it's for me at the moment.
Hi, my name's Eleanor Harding. I am the coordinator on the Heritage Lottery funded Far from the Western Front project. I'll speak very briefly about that. We're based in an Asian centre in North London that's kind of split between Indian and Pakistani community members. We work also in partnership with the Pak Cultural Society, which is a Pakistani community group. Rashid over there is their president. A Sikh Gurdwara and a Gurkha veterans organisation. And we are doing a project which is about the 1 million plus South Asian soldiers who fought in the First World War, all of them, and all of their diverse experiences, and the different places that they came from, the different things that they did, and the different ways that they would have viewed what happened to them, and the different outcomes, all of this sort of stuff. And so thinking about the challenges of that project, which I guess is where this started, that's a big one. How do we attend to that diversity? We're going to produce an exhibition and some digital stories, and the challenge of how to encompass all of the different experiences of people and the different stuff that happened in one project has been really, really difficult. And I think that we have found it difficult to pick a group or an individual and say this person can represent everything that everyone else experienced. So that's a challenge. The second one, I guess, is that the diversity of the community groups that are working on this project. They have many people, we come from very different places and bring a lot of different perspectives to this history. And so where you can get one group standing up and talking about how, bringing their own experiences and talking about how this war was about, people's experiences were about racism and exploitation and betrayal. And then on the other hand, you can have someone stand up and say, no, this is about glory, this is about honour, this is about pride. And they're all talking about the same war, but in so many different ways. How do we make it so that when they walk into that exhibition that we do in November, no one comes away being like, well, what was that? I didn't see anything of my story or my way of understanding this history. Added into that mix is that many of the volunteers, of whom some of them are over there, come from an academic background. You know, they've done a university degree in history, or they're looking to get into research or whatever. And so they are looking for something very different out of this project. They want a very nuanced, kind of academically rigorous account of what happened. And that's a lot of different things to try and pull together and represent, because all of them obviously have validity. It's just, yeah, how do we mediate between them? So that, I guess, is my challenge, and one that I'd be really interested to hear other people's perspectives on.
Thanks. Thank you. My name's Ajay Chabra. I'm the Artistic Director of Nutkhut. We're based in London, and our next challenge, so I'll start with our challenge, is to present the story of the convalescing soldiers, South Asian soldiers, in the pavilion in Brighton. So we're concentrating specifically on the pavilion rather than all of the other military hospitals in Brighton. And this has been a sort of 4-year journey. I didn't grow up, much like many of the other speakers, I didn't grow up knowing this story. I learned on the job, as it were. For somebody who failed all of his O-levels, to be in a place like this is fantastic, and speaking around a table. The year after I failed my O-levels, they introduced GCSEs. So I don't know whether that's related or not. So I suppose my entire journey has been about learning from others, learning and listening and absorbing information, and the starting place of my learning has been my family. And I think it's really interesting to hear. I've known Iqbal for 20 years, 25 years maybe, and I'm always interested in hearing that story, that multi-faith, artistic world in which his parents grew up in, and how they came together and loved each other and produced the embodiment of that love. But there are three experiences that provide the backdrop for me entering into this forum. One is my earliest memory. My earliest memory is dark, but I don't see. It's not a sad memory, but it always brings a tear to my eye. Just as much, it brings a tear to my eye when I hear the stories of the Indian soldiers. I'm not from a military background. I don't have any connections. We don't have a medal or a photo or an anecdote in our family archive. But my earliest memory is my nani's, my maternal grandmother, when her coffin was brought into my granddad's shop. So the shop was cleared out. So you've got chewits and sherbet dips and alcohol, and then my grandmother in her coffin, a bit like this. She wasn't as long as this. This was winter 1973, this was just between Christmas and New Year's Day. So my earliest memory is just my father saying, "You need to see your grandmother's face before we cremate her," and seeing that. And it was such a powerful memory, but I've never seen it as a dark, scary moment. It's just locked in my memory. So death, consequently, after my father's death and many of my uncles, I've always gone forward and said, I want to be there. I want to wash that body. I want to prepare that body for where they go to next. And it's been an honour and a privilege. And I think the second anecdote I wanted to talk about was the rainbow culture of my parents' friends. My Dad's best friend was from Dominica in the Caribbean. My dad worked for British Rail in the 70s and 80s. His second best friend, or equal best friend, was Pakistani from Lahore. And it was just very normal to hear Urdu and English spoken with an accent and speaking Hindi, and all this kind of mixture and cacophony of sounds and anecdotes. But it was the human connections that brought these three people together. And I suppose the third anecdote that where all this kind of comes from is the politics that bring people together. My parents met in London in the swinging 60s, fell in love, and the rest is history. But my mother was from Fiji Islands. My mother was born and grew up in Fiji. My grandfather was born and grew up in Fiji. Indians from central India. So my great-grandfather went to Fiji to cut sugarcane for the European market. And we heard those stories growing up, not in any rigorous detail, but they just became part and parcel of these stories. So Bhojpuri, the language that some of you may be familiar with, great actor Amitabh Bachchan is always famous for speaking in many Bollywood films, was always also part of the house. So we had Shuddh Hindi and Urdu at one level, and poetry at one level, and Bhojpuri, the language of the people and the villagers, at the other, and everything else in between. That's my mother's story. My father's story was Sargodha, Pakistan, partition, last to leave the village, 1947, August, turning point. And then consequently, my parents from two different parts of the world, from the South Pacific and from the Indian subcontinent, making London and England their home. Now, growing up in that kind of tapestry or that world, everything just becomes normal, mixing with different faiths or groups, etc. So that's the backstory. Then, obviously, O-levels, disaster. Always a fascination for the arts. The world, I think, in which I've come to inhabit is one of public space, and that's the transformation of public space. I'm interested, I make work in places where people congregate. I spent many years, working in institutions, in theatres, in public buildings. And it felt there was something that was okay about it, there was something not quite right about it. The hierarchy, feeling trapped, having an audience that you perform to that's in front of you, that's paid to sit there, it didn't feel democratic. I wanted to go and put this work into places where people just go shopping or are using as a thoroughfare, and where it's free. So free to public work is really, really important. So where have we ended up? We've ended up in Brighton at the end of next month. Very nerve-wracking and also very exciting. I've spoken to many people around this table who have contributed, who have engaged, who have said things that have found their way in this project. Dr. Blighty, the word Blighty is used from the word Vlad. Those of you who are familiar with Punjabi, Urdu, comes from the Persian foreign or the other. And that was also very important. That was a conscious decision to use a word which we collectively have appropriated as a word that we feel is a kind of slang word for England. And kind of going back to the kind of machinery of how that word came into the public domain. Doctor was important to talk about as Iqbal has referred to in his previous project, care and comfort and the treatment and the taking care of. Dr. Blighty. 6-day project. We're taking over Pavilion Garden. It was a conscious decision made with our funders and our partners to work in the public domain and to present the story not inside any of those buildings. We'll start on Tuesday and work through to Sunday, and we'll tell the same story every day. Every night at 9 o'clock for an hour and a half, we plan to project onto the eastern facade of the pavilion. So those of you who are familiar with Brighton Pavilion on the roadside, the East Lawn, is a beautiful, you can't miss it. If you're going into Brighton, it is the symbol of Brighton. It is what Brighton is essentially known for. So what better building to project onto? So we're bespoke creating what we're not describing as a film, it's a series of abstract projections with a soundtrack that will be 10 minutes long. And the loose narrative of that is we start in the village, we move the journey to Middle East, Marseille, we come to the Western Front, and we end up in Brighton. And in that 10 minutes, we're trying to crystallise and capture the very essence of that big story. So that will be a video projection, which I think will take people's, I hope it will, that's the idea, take people's breath away. It'll be projected every night from 9 to 10:30 for 10 minutes, with a short interlude, then 10 minutes, and then 10 minutes. So we're trying to have a footfall of the largest maximum possible audience that we can. And it's also entering into that digital age. It's telling a 100-year-old story, a story of history, of heritage, but bringing it to a new audience, and bringing it to a younger audience, and a family audience, and using colour and music and sound and light. So that's the video mapping. On the Saturday night, we're working with the Philharmonia Orchestra, who are based at the Royal Festival Hall, in a one-off paid audience. That's the only thing that's being paid, that people are being asked to pay for. In the Dome, we'll create a 2.5-hour performance, an East meets West, with South Asian artists and the Philharmonia's core artists. And that performance will be the glue for each of those pieces of music, both Western classical and Indian classical, will be the letters. So those letters will convey the emotion for the next piece of music. And it will be presented in the hospital ward. The Dome was as many of you will know from the images and the words, was a hospital ward. So I think that will be a very interesting and emotional piece of work. 25 actors, 9 of whom are professional, and the rest of whom are from City College and the University of Sussex and the University of Brighton, will take on characters. Half of those will take on characters from the period, so they'll be in period costume. We'll have a butcher, a military doctor, a matron, a nurse, some Indian soldiers, and half of them will be a contemporary group of tourists and a tour guide. So it's almost using a contemporary story, which is how the audience will see it, to access this historical story. It's just worth mentioning the team, Tom Piper, whose not his last piece of work, but his work that most people know, who's one half of the creators of the Tower of London Poppies, is designing for us on this project. And that in itself is very exciting. Tom comes from a very unconventional background to myself, where there's a very openness. The heart of this project is collaboration. It's about, it's not about the script and a single writer saying this is what we need to direct, actors act. It's been very much a large conversation. Tom's designing 3 installations, which are a kind of living interpretation of the hospitals themselves. And then a large series of community groups that we've been working with in Brighton, schools groups, etc., who will be performing throughout the week. I mean, too much detail. I won't. You can look at the website to find out more detail. There's a lot more in that mix. But the other final thing I just want to say was it's metaphor and symbols that we've found, and we've kind of teased into this story. How do we engage young people? What do we find for young people? Do we stand up and tell them the story? More often than not, that's one method. But for those younger young people, what we've connected is the mud of the trenches, and transformed that into a process where we've started quite an extensive schools workshop of creating diyas, pottery clay pots, and using that idea of this mud. We go in, we do these workshops using this diya to represent each soldier's life. And these diyas, these 2,300 diyas, will grow each night into an installation. And in essence, those diyas with the tea lights will represent the life of each soldier. And each of those diyas have been made by Brighton school children. And that's the point. The point is, it's just as much an Indian soldier's story, or the South Asian community's story, as it is a Brighton story. It's what we'd like to leave Brighton with when we pack our bags and disappear is for those young people, those 8, 9, 10-year-olds who have engaged in 1, 2 or 3 hour workshop, as they get older, to say, that building, I know exactly what went on in that building. I made a little pot for that project. I know that story. And that, if we can leave with that, I think we've done our job. Thank you.
Thank you for all the presentations. I'd just like to mention that, I'm very much aware that there are other people in the room who have for a very long time also been working on it and whom we couldn't ask or pressures of space. And I'd just like to mention a few people, starting with Amarjit Chandan, who had recovered and translated some of the Punjabi kind of laments which had fed into the exhibition and which are quintessential in recovering the home front. Rachel Halstead, who had worked a lot with the kind of walking kind of cemetery and mosque. Patrick Crowley, whose book on kind of Kut kind of has been just reissued. George Morton Jack, who has done the first kind of really rigorous kind of military kind of examination of the kind of experiences in the Western Front. Avin Shah from the creative sector, whose Subterranean Sepoys had been very influential. And also kind of Inderjit Singh, who is heading now the Memorials kind of Gates, which is a very prominent kind of landmark in London. And I'm sure there are also other people whom I don't have the kind of maybe the time, but maybe they can be kind of drawn in the conversation. But just to kind of sum up very, very briefly, because as expected and as I had feared, we had gone over time, seriously over time. But I just kind of like to kind of bring in kind of just a couple of things. I think most of the speakers started with saying that how they were amazed when they came to the subject that they didn't know about it. So there's a sense of kind of anger, outrage, wonder. And as Rosina said, kind of knowledge in the first thing. But then as Harbaksh put, it's also a question of interpretation. And Ajay, what you're doing is interpreting the story. And also spotting the gaps, kind of as Manish had been saying. But I think beyond this academic or beyond this kind of engagement often lies very deep family memories, family histories. And I guess kind of Iqbal is kind of Iqbal's story, I guess, kind of touched all of us, that there is something beyond just an engagement, something that is affective, that is something personal. It has to do with a sense of self. And I think one of the speakers mentioned, I think it was kind of earlier, that, some of the kind of meetings I had been to, they are some of the most passionate meetings when people come with their artifacts and people get kind of privately kind of annoyed or privately excited when they hear about these stories. I've worked on other things, I've never felt this sense of personal attachment. But also there are challenges, and I think some of the kind of final presentations brought that out, and I particularly have in mind what Elena was saying, starting with Harbaksh's kind of challenge of kind of people, resources versus the enormity of the scope. And what you were saying, that this kind of multiple histories, for some it's glory, for some it's a sense of shame. And I'd just like to briefly mention my own perhaps personal investment, which I came to realize only after I started academically kind of working on it. In my family, one of my kind of great uncles, I have kind of quite a few relatives who went as doctors. He went as doctor to the kind of, he was in the Brighton Pavilion, and he served for 3 years. His own brother, he joined the anti-colonial revolutionary networks, and he was imprisoned, and then he was beaten to death in a jail in Calcutta. So it's a very contradictory history that we have when we think of South Asia and the First World War. And in many of the projects which are important for, I think, as kind of Wes was mentioning, for kind of racial integration, I think some of the themes that come up again and again are the ideas of loyalty, ideas of valor, ideas of service. And I wonder whether kind of any of you would like to kind of comment on that, and why is there this need, if you want to make the past relevant to the present, to harp on these ideas? Is the need internal, or is the need external? Or do you think that if we give, or do you think that's the first step, and if we give a more messy version of history, it won't ensure visibility? Wes, and then Dominic.
An attempt to answer that from our own experiences, it's quite valid. Your point, especially thinking about it from a British Pakistani perspective. Whereas in India, Indians are starting to acknowledge, you know, the Indians who fought in the First World War. Pakistan still hasn't really, because it still, I suppose, associates those who fought with a colonial enterprise, and one that it doesn't want to associate itself with. So for British Pakistanis, it's not really something that's known about, and if it is known about, it's rarely something to be celebrated in the family. And so we're aware of that when we're particularly working with British Muslims in this country. I think you began to answer the question in how we choose to approach, is we do choose to approach it in a positive context, because that allows the beginning of a positive conversation. However, we don't exclude any debate that should bring out any complexity. The fact remains, and this is a personal battle that I've had to come to terms with as well, that whether these men fought willingly or unwillingly, whether they were forced to or whether it was the terrorist recruitment methods of General Dwight, the fact remains that they fought. And that contribution, regardless of the colour of it, remains. And it, as a British Muslim, or as a British Sikh, or as a British Asian, or as a British African Caribbean, youth, knowing that is important, because it allows you to feel that your ancestors have contributed to this country. And even amongst the white Britons, those white soldiers who fought from Lancashire, who fought, and I'm thinking of Lancashire, that's where I'm from, there are stories there also where there were young men who didn't have the most positive experience, who didn't really want to go and sometimes were forced to go, who were shamed into going, and when they were out on the Western Front also suffered abuse from other people, their officers. The class structure in Britain also made them subject to abuse. But the fact remains that we celebrate all of that, because regardless of the colour of their contribution, they contribute. Similarly, regardless of the colour of our contributions, we contribute.
Absolutely, I think all of us around the room will say that we want to absolutely recognize and highlight the contribution. But I wonder whether there can be a move beyond going to just a celebration, because it's a history of violence and a history of trauma, because you have the Khilafat movement at the same time. You have other Muslims, Turkey, for example. So, like the Jews, it's Muslims fighting other Muslims in the First World War. And these are maybe things, I completely understand that, for racial integration, we need to start with the positive thing, but I wonder whether there can be a way towards slightly problematizing
I'd like to think that it is, but once we've established some stable ground.
Right, okay, thanks.
The whole thing.
Sorry, Rosina, I think Dominic wants to say something.
I think for me, it's I can only speak in a very personal thing, that it's not really, I'm trying to get away from what needs to be done. And I did say that I do use it as a way of looking into pre-partition and how the communities, particularly Hindu, Muslim, Sikh and others, are relating to each other. So I have done that, but now I'm trying to see something like this, which is written very close to the time, only 20 years after, or less than 20 years after, as a piece of literature. And I don't like to see it as a piece of heritage literature, because I like to see that this is a story worth all of us knowing. And the second thing is that I'm getting more and more interested in what's happening in that period of those 4, or around those 4 years. I mean, it's a shame Amarjit has gone, because he's done some work around the Gadar movement. And there is some significant poetry in Punjabi and Urdu, which is very defiant, and which is happening at the same time as this, and it's very powerful stuff. So we want to look at those voices as well.
Absolutely, because this book, Across the Black Waters, is not at all a celebration. It's showing how nasty and horrible war is. He's a complete nationalist, Anand, so it's very much he is anti-colonial, so it's very much an anti-colonial protest against the war, drawing on the tradition of Wilfred Owen, but connecting it to anti-colonialism. So it is not at all a celebration of empire at all. It's very much anti-empire. Sorry, Rosina.
No, I was just going to say the whole issue is rather complex. And if I take myself as how I began, and the general kind of concept of immigrants at the time, that you are intruders in British society. We haven't done anything. You come to take our jobs and our houses and so on and so forth. So at that point in time, one of the ways to try and fight this kind of racism and to use the tool of history as a contribution was very important. And of course, in many ways, we are still thinking in terms of how much we have done, not only in war, but in other ways. But society is very complex, and things have changed, in some ways for the better, in some ways for the worse. We have Islamophobia now, not just racism. And of course, then of course we have to worry about, it becomes in a sense a bit of a communalism, because then the Muslims will say, well, we did this, and possibly the Hindus and the Sikhs want to break away from the Muslims, because after all, we are different. You know, we are not extremists and terrorists and all the rest. And so of course they tend to stress certain other issues. And we tend to lose sight that when this was all done, fought, it was unpartitioned India. And of course, if you look at the army, it had Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus, all sorts of people. And the interaction between them, the whites, the citizens, and of course the way they each saw each other. In a way, it's an integrated thing. And I think to move forward, we mustn't lose sight of this integration of people and move away from ghetto histories. And because things are changing, and life is very different now from the 60s, 70s, 80s when I began.
I think that's what kind of Manisha's group, the three groups, the Sikhs, the Muslims, and the Hindus,
yes,
are partly doing. I think
exactly.
Elena had a question.
Well, actually, Suman had her hand up.
Oh, sorry,
before
Suman
me,
said
so-
Sorry.
Yes, hi, Suman Butcher. I work in promoting arts and culture stuff in the UK. It's been very interesting hearing all the presentations. And in a way, it seems to me we're now taking for granted that we are celebrating, commemorating First World War Indian contribution. But what I would like to know is, from this knowledge of 100 years on, should we have participated? Should that be a question? You know, like 100 years, we can now see 100 years later, should they have fought in the First World War or not? Or did they have a choice? I am interested in the question of dissent, because up to now, none of the heritage projects have dealt with it, you know, and I just think that's bad. No, one last thing, and the most important thing that really bothers me is that, in a way, it's sort of been raised that it was an undivided army, it was okay, it was under the empire, but everything that's been happening now is focusing on specific contributions of specific communities. But what we're not taking from that is the fact that actually we were one people. And I feel that's a kind of an important message for young people today in this country, because our identities are getting very segmented and fragmented. People are defining themselves in a very narrow way, and that troubles me. Thank you.
It troubles me too.
Okay.
Can you just quickly chip in and answer? Because I completely believe in your thing, this kind of Asian or kind of undivided India. But I had a very interesting conversation with Amandip Madra from UK Heritage, because they asked him, why just the Sikhs? Why don't you kind of highlight all of India? And it was very interesting to hear Amandip's thing, saying that if they issue a call for an all India kind of interest in the war, it's very little response. Whereas the moment they plug into a particular community, there's an enormous amount of response. And I think that's a problem we have to grapple with, and often by maybe targeting kind of particular audiences, they can go a long way maybe, because the Sikh investment in it had been amazing, and it's part, and I don't know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's because it was targeted towards a particular religious community that they had that kind of outpouring. So there is something to do with, community thinking and contribution. Sorry, Eleanor.
Oh, well, I suppose I just had one question, which is, I was wondering what you meant by we're all one people, because of course we were all one people technically as the British Empire. The idea that we segmented off even to the Indian subcontinent is quite interesting, because there will have been there were similarities of experience across lots of different ethnic groups, and so that's a question as well. How we can either narrow it very closely onto a group that speaks to people's sense of identity, or as you say, maybe try and push that identity more broadly, and rather than me always only retweeting stuff about Indian soldiers, maybe I should be looking much more to soldiers from the West Indies, soldiers, I don't know, Africans, everyone from all over the world, and stop thinking about it in terms of these boxes, but then obviously it's difficult to speak to people.
Thanks. There are quite a few hands. Why don't we collect quite a few questions, because that will open up several avenues and then we can maybe approach. So there's Inderpal, there is Jasdeep, and there was someone, okay, Inderjit. Okay, so if you could keep your questions short and then we collect the questions.
Yeah. Just very briefly, Inderpal Ganjal from Legacy of HERA Project, and again, like everybody else here, we started this journey about not knowing much about that history earlier. So that process for us was basically learn, and then not only learn, but understand. You mentioned about the complexity, why were the volunteers, were they forced, and so on. So again, we tried to focus on the sort of that aspect, and we felt that it is not a sort of a simplistic answer we can provide. You mentioned about one people, but again, we felt that even within sort of India, it was like a unity and diversity where people were living there in one place, but they had a different tradition, different viewpoint, and so on, which is again reflected today, and perhaps that has been strengthened by the political sort of environment of today. But also, we wanted to share, like Harbaksh mentioned, share what we have learned, which is a very little we have learned. So we share within our community. So our project is within the heart of community. But what fascinated our project, and when many people who asked this question to us, what was the environment, the political, the social, the economical environment back home in India at the time, and understanding of that, even though the war was not fought on Indian soil, but how they actually have sort of not only contributed in terms of manpower, but the resources, money, finances, how the war was financed. So there are some fascinating data is sort of coming forward there. So we need to interpret that and understand into overall totality, and then not only sort of delve into very great detail, because the community is what we feel outside London is that they don't even know there's a helicopter view of the whole journey from the arrival of a soldier here or elsewhere to the sort of end, and what happened post end of World War I.
Question.
Yeah. And the question again is how do we in this room bring together all effort we are making in our own way, and have a consistent sort of a viewpoint which you can take it out to the sort of a community at large. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks. So, kind of how do we unify our efforts and bring it forward? Jasdeep?
I wanted to respond to some of the questions that we've had so far. We've worked at the museum for over a period of 4 years with different communities, and actually one of the things I started working with was a series of workshops with the British Sikh community, because that's what our activity plan had laid out. But to respond to some of the projects, I felt, and certainly from our experience, is having developed a strong relationship with one community, they responded a lot stronger because it was targeted towards their own community. Then we took those lessons, and now we've stepped back and opened up to other communities. So we're looking at the British Muslim contribution, the British Gurkha, the Nepali contribution, and the British Hindu contribution on a wider level. So what we've done as a museum, and probably to respond to some of the points, is first target certain groups separately, because they are more responsive. They certainly are, we felt that. Then bring them together, if they would like that, on a platform where they can share across those boundaries and boxes that have been created. But I think those boxes had been created because the response is just a lot faster. But if we remain in those boxes, then we'll have problems, because not the whole story is told. But if we perhaps if you want to start with us and branch out, we've certainly had great responses as a result. And I would like to say the topic of loyalty and dissent had been touched on at the UK Punjab Heritage Association exhibition, and these sort of themes are things that really need to be explored more, and they are being. So.
Thank you. Imogen Singh from Memorial Gates. Just to give 2 seconds of introduction to it, we started this particular monument to the commemoration and the contribution from the First and Second World War back in 1999. And we were told that you've got to build it in some godforsaken part of the UK. We said no, we want it outside Buckingham Palace or Constitution Hill and nowhere else. And we fought for that, we built it. It's there. It's the only commemoration to British India, British Africa, and British West Indies. And that's the only monument that exists in this country today. Having said that, I'm interested more on the dissent side, given that we have on our council, which I chair, the field marshals who actually served and led the battalions in the Second World War. People like Field Marshal John Chappell, Field Marshal Evelyn Webb Carter, and so on and so forth, and Viscount Slim. What I would say is that there is a thinking amongst some of the establishment that dissent is not tolerated even today. You cannot bring it up. Let me illustrate that by saying whatever's going to happen, I'm not prejudging what's happening in the Brevard Pavilion, but you wouldn't find in the common narrative that's going around at the moment, which is that the soldiers who were injured, who was brought to the Brevard Pavilion for treatment, there was barbed wire across the whole compound to make sure they did not interact with the women in Brighton at that time. So how much of that is going to be illuminated in the stuff that's going on in the psyche of the 8 and 9-year-olds we're talking about today? It's important for us to look at that dissent. I'm chairing that particular council with the view that we need to go not just at the black and minority ethnic communities in this country, because that's what the ghettoism comment that was made earlier. The education curriculum in this country, which I worked on in my professional capacity, does not have the space or the time. I mean, Dominic mentioned when he was 16, he knew everything about World War I. I'm sorry to say, the picture hasn't changed much. The national curriculum is probably more parochial than it was in his days when he was a 16-year-old. So there's a job to do, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten the historian's name at the front, the lady who's Rosina. Her challenge from the 1993 Ilya days is become even more acute, I would say, in today's Britain, today's London. Somebody mentioned Leicester, Jasdeep, I think, and another, sorry, the colleague next to Pervez. You know, you've got the ethnic minority majority, and we're talking to ourselves, frankly. And the second thing on dissent I would illustrate by saying that Viscount Slim was on Radio 4 last week at 8:30, 8:40 in the morning, and he basically said Subhash Chandra Bose was a traitor. And this is the thinking in the establishment even today. And any dissent is not tolerated, will not be tolerated. So we need to be creative in bringing this out. That there were people who were pushed into serving for the empire, because I represent not just the Indian, undivided India, but also British Africa and British West Indies. So my canvas is vast, and I need to make sure those stories are told. So my challenge to you guys is, how do we engage those communities with us? Not just talk about the Asian diaspora or the British India, because only last month you were there. We had the commemoration during the Commonwealth Day. We had John Whittingdale, who's the Secretary of State for the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, the very guy who has a seat at the table to talk about these things. And he's in the press for the wrong reason since then. We won't talk about that. And we also had the new Secretary General of the Commonwealth, Baroness Patricia Scotland, who just assumed that responsibility. So we've got very good, powerful voices with us. It's how we utilize that going forward. And it's not just about grants and money, as Dominic said. We can do it without the funds, but it helps if we have the money.
Hi.
Can we collect 3 questions, maybe you and then Kevin and then Eleanor? and then we'll respond to some of the questions.
Perfect. So I'm Elizabeth Weidler. I'm at UC Santa Barbara.
If you speak up a bit, that would be helpful.
Oh, I'll try. I'm at UC Santa Barbara, and I've really noticed that within all of these discussions, we're talking about history and commemoration, especially grassroots commemoration, as though they're the same thing, but they're very different sorts of endeavors. And so I'm wondering sort of what space is being made to be more cognizant of some of the goals and motivations of people that are engaging in these, because I think you answered your own question within your statement. So you had said that if we're trying to make the past relevant, why use words like loyalty and valor and things like that? But that's exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to make the past relevant, and people are engaging with it and making it relevant for themselves based off of their experiences. So it's a very complicated sort of relationship between how we commemorate and how we historicize. And so the question is, are we making space to allow that? Are we being cognizant of those differences in the way that people approach these projects from a very personal level? So, because we all are personally, but there's other people. Thank you.
Yes, I'm Kevin Baker. I'm from the Royal Pavilion. I was sort of really just picking up on Inderjeet's point about the sort of narratives that we talk about dissent, because in addition to projects like Dr. Blighty, the story of the Indian hospital has been pretty much part of the core pavilion visit offer now for about 6 years, and I've worked in various parts of it. And yeah, it's interesting, strand of conversations make me think a lot about the sort of layering of narratives that we use. So for example, 90% of the visitors who come to the pavilion will know nothing about the Indian hospital story at all. They come because they see it as being a Regency Palace. So the small gallery there is really just the introduction. It's largely on the shock that this happened here. Why did that happen? And then also there's a specialist audio talk that actually tells a slightly richer story, and that does talk, for example, about the kind of the fence there. And then I'm also aware that when I give talks occasionally about the subject, I do talk an awful lot about the relationships with women in the political side of the hospital. And I think, you know, there's definitely ways that I would like to improve that kind of layering of storytelling, but I think it does really come down to the audience and what you're really trying to achieve in those different spaces. And I think it's very hard, particularly in somewhere like a museum, and I think other museum people here may agree or disagree with me, when you're actually trying to tell a story, often with very confined media. You know, you often have, say, text panels that will give you, say, 900 words to talk about an entire episode, and sometimes, in our case, very few objects. And it really is about that selection of the audience and actually where you want to give people. I mean, my view when we first worked on the small gallery in the pavilion 6 years ago now was really just to surprise people, just to give people that opening thread that we would hope they would explore later on. And I say by no means have we got that perfected. I think we're still in the early stages of a long, long journey. But I think it's not to suggest if those things aren't immediately evident, it's not that we're not aware of them, it's just we're really kind of picking and choosing what we tell to whom at that moment.
Thanks. Can I just add that as part of our project and the exhibition that launched it, in terms of our interpretation of the story, we began by looking at India's contribution, and then we focused in on the Punjab, where maybe half the army came from. And we talked very clearly, we had a whole panel, lots of illustrations on the coercion that was used in terms of recruiting them. And then we had another panel and illustrations talking just about the Ghadarite movement in Punjab and around the world, the revolutionaries who were opposed to the extent that they were blowing buildings up and doing whatever they did. So we have tried to map the story in its entirety as much as we could.
This was in the exhibition. Yeah. Okay, thanks. Just quick. Oh, sorry, Rachel.
Okay. I just wanted to bring in.
Introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry, Rachel Hasted, and I was the head of diversity at English Heritage when the planning for commemoration of World War I was in place. I'm now retired, but I did become involved with looking at the Woking Muslim burial ground, which was then in a very bad situation, and the whole issue of memorials to the Indian Army in World War I on British soil, which I was quite surprised to discover existed. I went on to do a piece of work on this, which you can find published on the Exploring Surrey's Past Muslim Burial Ground webpage. And I want to just bring in the fact that the history of memorialisation and forgetting of the Indian contribution to World War I is in itself a historic issue. And my piece is about the way in which that history of contention on the subcontinent, which I am delighted to hear that TNA is going to be focusing on, is actually intimately linked to the way the British in this country thought about that contribution and in some cases highlighted it during the war itself and then suppressed it afterwards. And there are very obvious links. And I think we need to notice our own surprise and how natural it seems to us that this had been forgotten and question that as historians.
I think I would add on to what Rachel had been saying, the whole problem or issue of memories, memorialization, and then ending it up as celebration, rather than thinking in terms of equality and how we really move forward, rather than just talking amongst ourselves. We have to open it up.
Absolutely, thanks. If I could very quickly recap kind of a couple of the points. I think that to go back to kind of Indrajit, I think Indrajit and Jasdeep kind of, to go back to some of the points, I think yes, it is a problem we are speaking amongst ourselves. We are already preaching to the converted. But to link it to what Jasdeep was saying, what he said about kind of start with individual religious communities, that you have to start with little compartments, but then it becomes dangerous to stay within the compartments and we have to spread our wings. I wonder whether, Indrajit's points that a creative way of introducing the idea of dissent into the official vocabulary which is so resistant to it. And I think we have to think about it quite seriously, because though I'm, always want to highlight dissent, my heart sings when I read Boris Johnson writing about the part Kenyan ancestry of Barack Obama and the ancestral hatred of Churchill. And then I realized that, dissent is far away. First, you need that sacrifice or that narrative. Or, for example, the whole Tory campaign that we are kind of seeing against kind of Sadiq Khan. So I think that loyalty and valor are kind of perhaps the first kind of baby steps, but is there a more creative way of also introducing dissent without unleashing the force of kind of xenophobia? And one of the ways I was thinking, we are completely dependent on institutions like the National Archives and the Imperial War Museums because they have knowledge. As Rosina said, the first thing is knowledge. And it's about sources, how you present sources and how you display sources. And I wonder whether we could allow sources to tell the story and argue with each other, saying that these are conflicted narratives, these are contested narratives. So we are not doing the interpretation. It's the sources that that are made to do the interpretation, because I think then some of the, then even some of the most important people who have the most influence, they are forced to take heed, because it's not a paltry academic kind of saying things, but the sources tell very different stories. And I wonder whether you'd like to have anything to...
We're at an early stage, aren't we, Iqbal? We found various things. One of the areas that we're looking at is sort of Middle East records we have. We have a sort of commemorative journey where we've looked at the the South Asian contribution to the First World War. We're looking at Africa at the moment. We're coming to Middle Eastern, and we're going on because we're trying to look chronologically at how troops got involved in the war. And it was perhaps because we started looking at the South Asian records we had, which was strong in terms of facts and figures in terms of our Operation War Diary, but lacked the stories that we felt would engage communities, which is the area we're interested in working, that led us to look at some of the wider records around the Middle Eastern campaigns, which is where some of the care and comfort aspects were coming through that Iqbal identified. But within that, then we were finding some of those areas of where things started to become a little bit more challenging for us as interpreters, because we were starting to hear some of those voices. And Iqbal, you would say more about this incredible story that there's two brothers, one who fought, the other who...
Or the Mirmas.
Yes, which
stories.
is fantastic, where you've got such opposing, within that family relationship, we've got such opposing relationships. It's just made us realise perhaps the huge potential about looking at something that isn't much discussed. I like your idea of, well, I like the idea of working creatively, but I also like the idea of working using those letter resources speak for themselves, because we do, as a government, as an agency, have the problem of the agenda that we promote. So we do need to rely on those documents
what
to
you
speak
select,
for themselves.
I guess, and what you choose to
Yes.
showcase.
Yes, that's right.
Because if I can just jump in again, I think Kevin Bacon did something quite amazing. And I remember in 2014 when I was in an HLF kind of little symposium of kind of 4 person with a huge audience in the VNA, I was asked not to mention the barbed wire, and that was the first question from the audience. This lady said, why don't we see pictures of Indians with civilians? And I think over the last 2 years, Kevin with his kind of blog posts, you haven't shied away. You have mentioned the barbed wire. It's there on the blog. You also have mentioned how that many of the photographs in the Brighton Pavilion, they were completely staged. They were under duress, so that we see the reflection of the photographer and the military person being reflected on the mirror. And I thought that was fantastic, so that it's now more known, I think, maybe not at the political Chileans, but kind of among general public than it was in 2014 about the barbed wire. And I think these are the ways we can maybe make a slight, kind of begin to make some impact on the larger kind of changes in the thought processes. Ways?
I think just to say also in Birmingham, I found that, look, if you're going to work with young people in Britain today who come from any minority background and pretend there was an era where, you know, their ancestors and the white officers got on really well and everybody was on a level playing field and we all played football in between the battles, then that's not going to wash, you know, on our young people today. And in Birmingham, you know, we were working with a guy called Jahan Mahmood who does these presentations, and he quite expertly, I think, introduced the idea that, you know, there was dissent. And it wasn't all roses. And even when they went on to interview some of the descendants of those, the family descendants of those serving soldiers who live in Birmingham, some of them said, you know, we're not particularly proud of this. We think it was, you know, them abetting the empire. None of that prevented the young people from feeling a claim. It's not a pride, but it's a claim to Britain. So I think, you know, we can afford our audience more than we do, I think. Yeah.
Absolutely, because, you know, when I go to the schools, often the school kids ask the most brilliant questions because they are uninhibited. Because I was speaking to kind of sixth form at the sixth form school, and the first questions were, as kind of you were saying, that should we have 4 bridges are very big and they're question, but they're thinking about it. But the other thing I was thinking about, maybe it's also very good for us to go on about dissent, particularly for us academics, because we are sheltered, kind of, you know, we have kind of secure jobs. People who are on the firing, you know, end of the firing line, who often face daily maybe kind of racism and abuse, for them I think it perhaps may be quite important first to have this claim, as you say, and then complicate it, because when I'm slightly problematizing my own position of dissent, because I can see it's a very complex position to embark on.
It depends also on your agenda, doesn't it?
Yes, exactly.
So you're an academic and you just want to get information out.
Yes.
If I'm going to Bradford and I'm trying to get British Muslims to integrate back into society, not that all of them need it, but some do. Yeah.
Yes.
Then I'm not going to go in and say, listen, they were, you know, kidnapping your ancestors so that your great granddad could go and fight. They've got enough, you know, to kind of. They've got enough ammunition to feel ostracised in this society already. So for my agenda, it doesn't suit that. Not yet anyway.
In that sense, is there a contradiction between, in that sense, history and commemoration? And I think, as the lady there said, between what happened and what we choose to remember.
Contradiction between history and history.
We're sanitizing it. We're self-censoring.
Yes, absolutely.
We are airbrushing out the history yet again.
Yes.
This is an opportunity. This window is not going to come back.
No.
This 4 years commemorations. I mean, I was part of some of this, the setup behind the scenes and the back office stuff. This is the only opportunity we've got. And in my particular standpoint on this is, I've got the biggest hitters in terms of the war, Second World War, on my council, who served, who led the battalions, and then once they pass away, the knowledge and the experience and the shared history is going to go with them, unless we capitalize it now. This is the only window we have. And how we do it, I share your point about Islamophobia and the narrative around Sadiq Khan in London, it's not particularly nice. And we need to find creative ways of saying it's okay if you dissent. It's okay, it's acceptable. It's how you portray that. And I'm looking around the table, I haven't got the answer to this. We need to be creative around this. If it's okay for us to have these discussions in the safe environment of an academic institution, why is it not to have the same sort of conversation in a community hall, in a town hall, or any public space for that matter? We need to create that dialogue.
There's some more.
Yeah, Seb Hall from British Armed Forces Association. There's an interesting question about dissent and how that's posed from a military perspective. The appetite to talk about dissent in the military does not exist, full stop. So I appreciate I'm talking to somewhat of a lay audience, and you probably appreciate that from my perspective, talking about dissent is slightly uncomfortable, but that's what makes it interesting. If we talk about the experience of soldiers, irrespective of their descendancy, we talk about valour because it's an interesting thing to see what an individual will put themselves through, not for themselves, not for their self-worth, but for their comrades and their counterparts who they find themselves on the battlefield with. So that's an interesting point to start the conversation at. Where we then progress that to, and I think there's more and more of an appetite to talk about this post the Afghanistan campaign of late, is post-traumatic stress disorder. And so rather than looking at dissent as such, looking at PTSD, looking at the experience of soldiers who may have found themselves on the battlefront without necessarily having appreciated what they're signing themselves up for, that potentially presents a different lens from which to view things without going into a realm of dissent per se, but gives a different experience. You know, if we talk about John Smythe, and we were talking about him this morning, John Smythe got the VC, his 10 sepoys that went with him, what recognition have they achieved? By looking at the experience of those individuals, I know this is something certainly that we're interested in. If others are, we'd more than happily collaborate. But that might be an interesting view.
I think PTSD, I think it's a different topic. It's not just for kind of South Asians. This is, a forum on South Asian debate on the dissent. Just because it's not that the army doesn't think about it, doesn't mean it shouldn't think about it. And as Indrajit was saying, dissent does not mean disloyalty. It's a critical self-reflection, and you are, in fact, our ideal audience. Because I think the point we are trying to say is that dissent does not mean disloyalty, it means a different point of view. It does not mean also treachery. And that's the card with which, for example, it's easiest to taint. That's the card with which, for example, Modi kind of taints many of the people who dissent against him. So I think that's very important. It's a very important distinction to be made. And I think what Indrajit was saying, is there a creative way of weaving dissent into the narrative? Because to go back to Avez's point, yes, they are maybe disgruntled, they feel disenfranchised, they feel marginalized. But is it, in that sense, it's a genuine question I'd often thought about, that can we achieve multiculturalism by sanitizing history and kind of putting unsavory things under the carpet? Because after 5 years, after 10 years, they will find out. And then if they may say that, can I just finish that? When you said, I didn't know that, whereas if I'd known that, I could have accepted it and walked through that process. It would have been a difficult and painful process, and perhaps it may have helped me ultimately to racially integrate better.
Of course.
So, yes.
Three very quick ones,
Yes.
because I must go.
If you introduce...
Patrick Crowley, I wrote Kut 1916. And also various other things, but I served for 34 years in the army as well. Three very simple things. The first thing is, I think what's going on by different people here with their projects is amazing and fantastic and great. And it's really important to get these messages out. So that's, I think, really, really good. The second thing is related to what was said about duty. It's duty. For most soldiers, they just get on with the job. And that's, 90%. So many of the other topics, and just supporting what you said, are very interesting and are very attractive, particularly to the media. But most people just get on with their job. And I know that sounds very basic, but that's very true, I think. And the third thing is the challenge of getting the message out within the wider context, because most people in this country don't even know the dates of the First World War, let alone.
They're getting to know. If you look at the survey that was published, it's now 56% who know. 56% report, and it's increasing. It jumped from I think 42 to 56 within 1 year.
If you believe all statistics, but they haven't even heard of Mesopotamia. They've never heard of Salonika. They've never heard of all these places, let alone who was fighting there and what types of people were fighting there. That's the wide context. So I'm very supportive of what everyone's doing, but I just think it's worth bearing that huge context in mind, because this is a lot of detail and a lot of academic specific stuff, which is fantastic. But overall, you've got to get over a sort of tsunami of ignorance to get there. I just make that point because there's so many basic things people don't know, let alone the detail of what Sikh regiments did or whatever.
But that's why we have the National Archives and the papers from the
We're all having all of them.
Sorry?
That's why we have commemoration.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it's not. There's no celebration. And the word celebration has been mentioned. Nobody anywhere mentions celebration. It's commemoration.
No, some have mentioned actually celebration, and some of the South Asian people who have been involved in commemoration, they have mentioned celebration, not once but several times, and have been corrected. And in that sense, it had been fantastic that Sir John Chappell, who had been the Air Marshal, he corrected, I remember, publicly in Delhi, Indians who were using the word celebration, saying not celebration, commemoration, and that's coming top down. I think. Sorry.
Can I just very sorry, I know there's lots of other, just very quickly, I just wanted to Inderjeet totally on the page. I mean, but I just wanted to link your comments and Aveza's comments. I kind of respond to your school of thought. If I'm going into communities, now I work on the ground. In order to make these projects happen, I need to work with a range of participants who have no engagement. And I agree with Patrick's point, that we need to get through the first layer of activity. But without an anchor and without an in, you can very quickly turn people off or away. I'm all for sadly we're not using barbed wire in Brighton, but we're using another device, let's say, another sort of theatrical device to interpret the fences going up, because essentially, but if we use barbed wire as opposed to use that as a metaphor, we need a hook. We need a hook to draw people in, and we're in it for the long game. I think our motivation is to attempt to tell this story in an artistic way, in a way which brings people in, but try and keep with that story. We haven't got a huge plan behind that, but it is to keep engaged. So I just wanted to not ignore, which I'm completely on the same page as Dissent, but the way in which to do it is through these anchors.
I agree, and just to clarify, I'm not suggesting that we sanitise information, it's just how we deliver. I think that's, at the moment, where we're finding what works.
Is that we go in with a largely positive story, but also introduce, the narrative of dissent and of complexity. But that's not our dominant narrative, because we don't feel that that's what the ground is ready to take it.
At this stage, at least, Inderjeet, I think Dia had her hand. Okay. Or Sejal. Okay, Sejal.
Yes, I'm Sejal Sutaria at King's College. Two thoughts. I think the contributions here really do such a wonderful job of exposing the way we're, I think, trapped in this way of either seeing discussions about war as commemoration of valor or as sacrifice. And that squeezes out opportunities to talk about dissent, not just in the armed forces themselves, but what those contributions or costs actually end up meaning after the war is over. So after Across the Black Waters that you were holding up is another novel about the main protagonist in Across the Black Waters and what happens to him after he's demobilized for assumed dissent or assumed treason, right, when he's in prison, right, when he's a prisoner of war. So I wonder if one way to approach this would be to think about dissent as something that happens afterwards, right? And that on one hand you've got people that are serving in the war and not always by their own volition, and they do have to get on with, you were saying, with their duty, right? That they're doing what they're doing. And there's a group of people who want to say, gosh, you know, these are unacceptable conditions, and then there are people that say, well, we don't want you to tell us that we're oppressed because maybe we're not oppressed, or maybe we are oppressed, but who are you to say so? So anyway, bottom line, I think expanding the context and thinking about impact, both on individuals and in larger terms, might be one approach.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks. Inderjit, Dominic.
Two things. I think
if you could keep you are usually short, but if you keep it brief, because we are running on.
Two things really. One is that I think it's not for me to say how artistic, creative solutions people come up with. There's one right version and there's another, and so on and so forth. I think that's it's a creative license everybody has, and how you deliver it is down to you. The second is, we're chasing grants, we're chasing money, and you started off by saying that, I think, in your opening remarks, and that somewhat colours the whole narrative for me, which is the HLFs of this world. I think the representatives are here, there are other funding bodies, the arts and so on and so forth. They have a particular lens through which they want to see this narrative played out. And in order to secure that funding, you need to play to those strengths, okay? And that's what's gone on. From my critique of everything I've seen so far, that's what's gone on. And what we haven't heard, your point about, dissent is a pretty strong and loaded word. I think it's a right word. And it's how you creatively play that into the narrative, because that's missing, and that doesn't tell us the whole story. And that's what's worrying me, because that will give some of the outlet to some of the youth of this country, the British black youth, the Asian youth, to say it was all right 100 years ago, it's all right to do that now in a different way, rather than the sort of the religious domain or the faith-oriented sectarian way that people talked about earlier.
I agree with that. Just a little tiny example of how things may change with HLF, in fact. In 2014, I was asked to go to HLF and give a little lecture, but I said that I'm quite unhappy with the way this kind of commemoration is going. And from various kind of community groups, there's quite a lot of resistance that who am I? You know, I can say this being an academic, but there people felt real problems. 2 years down the line, in 2016, I was called up by the HLF, I think by their vice president, and they said that they have brought out a book and they wanted me to do a little puff. And I said, you know, I don't really agree with your line. And they said, no, we want you to write what have been left out of the book. And this is coming from HLF. So things can change, and say that feel free to say that what is unattractive, what is messy, and that it is a sanitized version. So I think if we keep at it and be a bit diplomatic, I think diplomacy is needed. And I think I was speaking to people from the HLF, and who are the people from the HLF?
I'm here from Liz. She's
there. Oh, you're Thomas. Things are sorry.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I should out myself. I'm a policy advisor, communities and diversity at HLF, and I'm here with my colleague who is responsible for the Festival of Commemoration Stand. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Throughout this, I've been thinking it's a privilege to be here, and it's a privilege also to talk very frankly about power relations, which HLF actually is very familiar and comfortable in thinking about. So in terms of spending National Lottery players' money, we reflect contemporary Diverse UK. And I was thinking in parallel, when we were touching on dissent, of a project, a First World War project in Scotland in a prison called Brothers Behind Bars, where conscientious objectors, the history of conscientious objectors, was presented within the prison, where men who had very complicated relationships to aggression, to violence, to pacifism, could learn about the role of conscientious objectors in the First World War. I'm thinking about work with MENCAP, a learning disability organisation, really painful contested histories of people living in care in the UK. That's an HLF funded project because we're interested in the complexity of all of us in the UK. So, you know, of course I apologise on behalf of the organisation if there have been hurts, rejected grants, all sorts of aspects of the history that are in here that are painful for people. But I'd like us to propose that culture is a dynamic process, and the contestation of these histories is something that all of us have a vested interest in working on creatively, and certainly from an HLF point of view, that's why we really wanted to be here. So I'm very happy, you know, my colleague Lucy, you know, to take individual questions or points. Our emails are on this. But I would really want us to see how collectively can we think about moving forwards, because contested histories are so important, not only in terms of ethnicity and faith, how we think about sexuality, disability, gender, the power relations that we've touched on this afternoon, you know, concern us all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just add to that? I think the dissent should be part of our narratives. I agree with that. But I think we should not forget about the objectivity. It shouldn't make it a focal point, so it can drown all other sort of part of the history, and it should be proportionate and put in context. And that can be actually through various means, creatively, academically, and in other means, can be sort of put out through experiences, individual as well as collective.
Any other, we are almost near, we are getting gone short of the time, but if you have any points, and I'm really sorry that I think no, because you had a question before and then suddenly went out of mind. I'm really sorry.
So if there's anyone who hasn't spoken?
Yes, who hasn't spoken and have some.
I mean, I invited a few people today who are completely, you know, sort of blind.
Yes, sorry, yes. Because often people who are outside my field of vision, yes.
In my opinion, saying about all the participants,
say your name, sorry.
Say your
name.
I am Ghulam Raza, and I have been serving in the military, and now I have done MA History and Arts and Science of Warfare. So, and my grandfather also participated in this Mesopotamia. So that's I have some relation with this forum. My point of view is that this fighting and like allied nation or satellite states or something which we call it in history, it has been always, the history has been traditionally like that. If we see the Ottomans, the Janissaries, if we see the Romans, it is, we can say the First World War was somehow the last days of the imperialists, for example, the Austro-Hungarian, this French Empire and Ottoman Empire. So I think so the dissent is, again, it has its part, but the way that the change in the thinking of the rather the whole globe has come after that, which is very late, about maybe a century old. So instead of if we start finding the facts, which has been, the history has been very cruel. It has always been like starting from the Dark Ages when we started with the Stone Age. It's been very tough to live in those days. There was no human rights, no democracy, no independent voice. So instead of highlighting those things, which were, I can say, part of the horrible history, which we refer in the TV also, in the way of moving forward, instead of highlighting those points of dissent, if we want to really move forward, facts will remain fact, and it is somehow better to be under the carpet, because it is not only one ethnic group, or it has always, if we see the history, the globe overall, it has been moving here and there. First, start from Iranian Greece. Iran has many satellite Greek states fighting the Greeks, and then if the history goes on, so history will remain. So we should move forward with a brighter message.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Any other question? Any other issue? Someone question? Yes, you have. So if you could make it quick, brief.
Very brief
Thanks.
point. I'm Jasper Chalcroft, University of Sussex. I'm working on a project looking at European identities and cultural heritage in a big way, as in all of those complex, nuanced, subtle differences and dissent that exist across the continent with regard to all of the conflicts that Europe has seen, the ongoing ones right back and beyond the First World War. So my question is anybody here deliberately working with French activists, French groups that are dealing with the French sort of colonial troops and their experiences? Because I would imagine that working transnationally gives you a tool to talk to people about dissent, about different kinds of imperialist imaginings of others. We know that the French were able to touch and physically nurse Indian soldiers, which eventually the British were not allowed to do. So racial ideas are different as well from a French perspective. That gives you a technical tool, if you like, to shift the discussion, shift the debate.
There's a wonderful book which may be quite relevant to the discussion around dissent, because as Indrajit was saying, dissent can be a loaded term. It's called the embattled self, and it's about French colonial troops. I can put in touch with people, I know people who are working on it, because it's more of a conflicted sense of duty often. And just one thing I'd like to mention, it's quite interesting at least in academic history, it's a bit of a paradox. Here we are talking about imperial valor, honor, service. When we look at the bigger historical picture, First World War battlefields, they're often the grounds of radicalization. It's when the troops come back home, they have this sense of confidence, they have a sense of dignity, and that indirectly fuel the fires of Indian anti-colonial nationalism. So in a way, it's a paradox. It's a paradox that we are talking about. It's not, maybe when they're fighting, there is a kind of, meaning when they're fighting, we don't know, we can't enter their mind. But if we look at the bigger pictures, it is the beginning of Indian anti-colonial nationalism. So there is a different history there. So I think there are two histories which are quite charged, but which also have very different ramifications for kind of today's kind of political and cultural context, and it's a very difficult negotiation. So I think we are kind of dependent on community projects, on funders like HLF, and on creative artists, on how to present this more kind of contested histories, because I think we can also err on the side of dissent, because there may be some soldiers who have been kind of fighting for kind of England. So I think it's this kind of contested history that if we bring into the main narrative, I think that's what we are talking about.
We brought that element of dissent in a sort of a legacy of Weller exhibition last year about after World War I, here and there, what was happening here immediate after the cessation of World War I, and what was happening in India. Quite rightly, sort of, so that that was a turning point in the history for India.
Very quickly, is anybody looking at conscientious objectors, the shame narrative for serving troops, disobedience in the field, because it might be an interesting way of approaching it from experiential perspective?
Yeah, I'm just going to say that's the point I wanted to make. That private, peaceful, Michael Moore-Purgo's, that is the example of how these stories do help us to understand that, because Britain has been the only country that hasn't actually accepted the people who didn't go over the top. Basically, they were shot. They didn't pardon them yet. They haven't. But all the other European countries have, but we have not. So you're absolutely right. But the only way to actually, even in our novel, that subject is dealt with the Lalu's sort of dissent or supposed dissent. And when he comes back, he does, in the second novel, because part of a trilogy, he does fight for independence.
I think the other thing that I'm very interested to see that has never been mentioned over the last 2 years, and I'm just amazed, is the most important Indian, perhaps the most important global figure at that time, and that's Rabindranath Tagore, the Nobel laureate. And he is going to China, he's going to Japan, he's going to USA, he's going to England, he's meeting with Romarola, with Albert Einstein, with Rilke, with Freud. And what does he say? That I'm completely opposed to the war. This is butchery. And I think that is one way in which Indians or South Asians, British Indians, can still salvage a sense of dignity. Because he is Tagore, he's absolutely establishment, and is the most important pacifist voice. And he lived in Brighton for some years. And he has kind of open correspondences with prime ministers and with presidents of various countries at that time, saying that this is absolutely barbaric, what is happening on the Western Front. And it's very interesting, in all the commemoration projects
Tagore is the, he's the most important person at that time in some ways, most visible Indian. He has been completely silenced. But I think things are looking up, because I think even HLF, and I may be wrong, you can correct me, they are looking into more, as you said, more contested histories, and you are trying almost kind of consciously to have a more nuanced, to support more nuanced projects. I think
Could I just quickly add, do you think with HLF, given the discussions tonight, there may be, firstly, an opportunity for us to extend that funding availability beyond the war to look at the areas that are not perhaps being addressed as well as we'd like from the discussions this evening? Could that be extended, perhaps, that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I'd ask people who maybe haven't looked at the HLF website to look at strands like Young Roots, an area particularly looking at young people's experience. There's so many of the areas we've discussed tonight that could fit into that. Sharing heritage programs, there are programs outside the program that Lucy manages. So, yes, so many of these ideas tonight.
And I'd like to add one other thing as well. The other area that we're looking into is we're looking at those sort of research around the riots that happened across the country in 1919, which we think will actually echo a lot of these themes that we talk about. I no longer see it loyalty and dissent. I'm seeing it as loyalty, dissent, and everything in between, because the point that was raised about how people butchered themselves in order to be sent back, because having injured themselves in battle, they thought they would go home, and that was not the case. They went back to the front if they were deemed capable. So there are those grey areas, aren't there? And we mustn't be so black and white about it.
1919 would be great. You have the lynchings in America, black Americans being lynched. You have Amritsar massacre, and you have the Liverpool riots. So 1919 would be a fantastic. A final question, and that there we have to stop.
I was going to just give you Rabindranath Tagore remark a bit further, because First World War, the Indian subcontinent troops who served were basically given a promise of Dominion status along with Australia and New Zealand. The promises were not kept. Before they marched on the Mall, the victory parade here with the battalions, there was a massacre in Amritsar in 1919, which I'm actually working on at the minute with somebody else. And Rabindranath Tagore, he was knighted by this country through his knighthood at the Queen Victoria at the time, and said, this is how you pay my countrymen back for the services they rendered to the empire. I'm not having anything of it. So I think that is a really poignant thing to bring up. And if HLF and others are taking note of this, and I think that narrative needs to come out, that people like Tagore were prominent in leading some of those movements in India.
Absolutely. Tagore features in Dr. Light's features through the 6 days, particularly Summer's Pioneers, his poem that was written in spring 1915. I mean, it's a beautiful poem. And what we did just recently with Kevin at the Pavilion, we invited 25 Brightonians from 8 to 80 to read various pieces of material, particularly Tagore. And those natural voices will feature in the soundscapes and so when people hear Tagore's poem, it won't be an Indian accent. It'll be a 8-year-old Brighton child, speaking those words.
Thanks a lot. And also kind of Tagore's poems were read by Wilfred Owen in the trenches, the British poet. And the last words uttered by Wilfred Owen to his mother when he went for the first time was the quotation from kind of one of the poems, when I go from hence, let this be my parting word. And I think Tagore is a good figure to leave our discussion. Thanks a lot everyone for coming. Thank you very much.